Choosing the lighting for your exotic pet is going to, by far and large, make or break their health. It's one of the hard decisions that most pet owners are kind of stumped by. It's so different than a cat or dog, and you go to the pet store and you have a lot of different options. So what is going on with our light options? The different lights for reptiles, birds, and amphibians are important to understand in your selection, understanding your species. So to start, ultraviolet radiation, or UV lights. There's UVA, which is the longest wavelength, followed by UVB, and UVC, which is the shortest wavelength. UVA, unlike mammals, reptiles, birds, and amphibians can actually visualize UVA wavelengths. So it is important for food selection, habitat selection, species recognition. Some birds actually have different plumage that is only variable colors or appearances based on that UVA radiation. And then also for mate selection. So very important. UVB is what allows animals to synthesize vitamin D3 in the skin and also metabolize calcium in the body. If you do not provide adequate UVB lighting, this is going to be the one that really hurts animal health. Lack of UVB can result in hypocalcemia, which is low blood calcium, as well as soft eggs in females, metabolic bone disease, which is the big scary term for the soft bones. They may have a bone that looks kind of bent or crooked or wiggly, and be serious to try to repair that. And then overall poor immune function. UVC lighting is not actually necessary. In certain species and certain animals like scorpions, some keepers will use UVC lighting in the form of black lights to help show off incandescent, pretty colors in these species, but it's important to know not to leave that light on all the time because a high exposure in any animal can be detrimental. Bulb selection is very difficult, so we need to know the terms to know what bulb to go get. So you will see broad spectrum lights, which are also known as incandescent bulbs. Broad spectrum lights are like what you have in the kitchen, like what you use by your desk. They are only UVA. They don't produce UVB, and they're pretty cheap typically, so that can be a big thing to look out for. Of if you see something that says broad spectrum and then realize it's not very expensive, it probably isn't UVB. UVB is in full spectrum bulbs. These are our fluorescent light. They also contain UVA. And so that's going to be what we want, the full spectrum. There are three types of full spectrum bulbs that you'll see: the linear tube type, the spiral compact kind, and then the mercury vapor floods. The mercury vapor floods are really only necessary for large enclosures where you're also actually providing a heat source. For a smaller enclosure, I would strongly recommend having a separate light and heat source for your pet to make sure you're regulating everything appropriately. So using more of the linear tube fluorescent or the compact spirals are better. You also will need to get a little hood to make sure that we're directing that light downward into the enclosure, into the desired area. And with our light exposure, the factors that are important are the type of light we use, and we'll go into how strong it is, the strength, the distance from your pet, and then also how duration, how long are you leaving that on. You'll see the numbers 2.0, 5.0, and 10.0 to represent 2%, 5%, or 10% as far as the percentage of UVB in those bulbs. The intensity is determined again based on that percentage, as well as the age of the bulb and the distance to the animal. So these bulbs need to be changed out about every 6 to 12 months to make sure that they haven't burnt out of that beneficial UVB. You'll still see the light on, but the UVB is no longer effective. So you need to write down or mark when to change that bulb. Low UV bulbs like 2.0 are really best for our snakes, frogs, toads, salamanders, and potentially nocturnal animals. The moderate UV of 5.0 are for shady or subtropical species, and the higher 10.0 bulbs are for those really sun-loving desert animals or tropical animals that do want more sun. Now, I briefly mentioned they're nocturnal animals. So diurnal, daytime awake animals certainly need UV light. You should leave that on anywhere from 8 to 12 hours depending on the species, and depending on if you're working also on egg production and seeing how we're doing overall with health. The crepuscular, which are the twilight active, and the nocturnal, which are night active animals, are constantly debated as to whether or not they need UVB light. There are tons of studies going on in different species to determine this. And the takeaway is, while they go in and out of vogue, the takeaway is UVB light will not hurt them. The only downside is cost. So especially in animals that are crepuscular, that are awake, in the twilight hours and the morning hours, I would recommend using a UVB bulb because it's going to only help. Now, too much of a good thing can be bad. So if you're using too high of a dose of UVB light, or it is too close to them, you can see inflammation of the cornea, eyelids, and skin. You can see a suppressed immune system, egg hatching issues, and even thermal burns, that these animals can get sunburn. So be careful about your exposure. The number one question I get from people is, what constitutes appropriate light source? If my pet is on a windowsill and I leave that window open, all the time, or have the blinds open, is that enough light for them? No. If there is glass or plastic between the sun or the light bulb and your pet, we're not getting enough UVB. It's being filtered out. So you want to choose a top of your cage between the light bulb and your pet of a mesh or screen, because while that does still filter, it is much less filtration than glass or plastic. And honestly, the best thing to do is to intermittently, when the weather allows, if you're in a climate that allows for it, take this pet outside in actual sunlight, because that is far better than any bulb. Now, last thing, when you take home an exotic pet and you're making these tough decisions on our light fixture, our bedding, our setup, our humidity, all of these things, the number one thing is to research, where did this animal come from in the wild? Because then we can try to replicate that in captivity, figuring out how warm they need to be, figuring out how much light they prefer, how many hide areas. All of those are really, really important to delve into, and we're not going to be perfect. An enclosure in a room is never going to replicate the wild jungle, but we can do our best to make sure that we're supporting them and keeping them as healthy and happy as long as they can.